For 3 days, the Pawnee treated mountain men Hugh Glass and Clint like honored guests. They gave them food, new clothes, and a seat by the chief's fire. It was a bizarre, almost gentle captivity. Then, at dawn on the third day, the hospitality ended. They tied Clint to a wooden frame. This wasn't an execution, it was a religious ceremony, a sacrifice to the morning star. And Hugh Glass was forced to watch his only friend become the main event. The escape was an act of quiet desperation. Slipping over the side of the ship, Madeleine, like two ghosts, Hugh Glass and his companion Clint dropped into the warm, dark water of the Gulf. It wasn't a heroic swim for the shore, more like the desperate scramble of men who knew that staying put meant certain death at the hands of pirates. They made it to the coastline at high tide, gasping for air on the wet sand, the immediate danger behind them. For a brief moment, on the third evening of their trek inland, Hugh Glass felt the intoxicating rush of being a free man again. It was a sensation that wouldn't last. The world they had escaped into was not empty. It was simply a different kind of prison, one with alligators in the water and venomous snakes in the grass. As Clint grimly joked, "Seems that wherever we go here, something wants to eat us." Their plan was simple, born of the kind of hope that only truly desperate men can muster. They would head north, following the rivers, and then cut east until they hit the Missouri. From there, it was just a long walk south to civilization, specifically St. Louis. Hugh figured it would take them 3, maybe 4 weeks. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. He wasn't just wrong by a matter of days or weeks, he was wrong by years. The journey he thought would end in a bustling city would instead take him through the heart of a darkness he couldn't yet imagine. For now they walked, sleeping during the day and moving at night, their stomachs tied in knots from hunger. They had eaten almost nothing since leaving the ship. At one point, starving, they gambled on a bush of unripe berries, a sour and miserable meal that only sharpened their hunger. The land itself seemed to conspire against them, testing their resolve at every turn. While resting near a riverbank, Hugh came face to face with a cottonmouth snake, its ghostly white mouth gaping in a silent threat. He dealt with it, another small victory in a war he was slowly losing. But the physical toll was matched by a creeping psychological dread, a feeling that settled most heavily on Clint. He felt a profound sense of doom, a chilling premonition he couldn't shake. He tried to explain it to Hugh, a creepy feeling he'd never had before. The certainty that he wasn't going to make it out of this. Hugh, ever the pragmatist, brushed it off. He had to. Acknowledging that kind of fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. But the feeling lingered in the air between them, an unspoken prophecy waiting for its moment to be fulfilled. For weeks, they pushed north, the terrain shifting around them like a slow-motion dream. The desert-like plains gave way to rolling prairies thick with tall grass and wildflowers that stretched to the horizon. Eventually, even this landscape transformed, and the two men found themselves navigating heavily wooded hills. They traveled with a constant, gnawing caution, twice lying breathless and hidden as roving groups of native warriors passed just a stone's throw away. They assumed any encounter would be a violent one. It was the default setting for survival in this part of the world. In their quieter moments, they dreamed of St. Plaint 7-2, Louis, making plans to report the pirates in Campeche to the government. They imagined a clean end to their ordeal, a return to a world of laws and consequences, where the bad guys get blasted to hell by the Navy. It was a comforting fantasy. The end of their journey as free men came not with a bang, but with a poke. Hugh was asleep, a deep, exhausted sleep, when something jabbed him hard in the ribs. He rolled over, his mind struggling up from the depths of unconsciousness, and sat up with a jolt. They were not alone. 6 men stood over them, figures from a nightmare. 3 were on horseback, and 3 were on their feet, looming over the 2 sleeping forms. Hugh had never seen Indians like these. Their faces were painted in terrifying patterns of red, yellow, white, and black. Some had their heads shaved in the Mohawk style, with feathers braided into the remaining hair. One of the mounted warriors wore a wolfskin across his shoulders and a necklace made of enormous claws, claws that could only have come from a great bear. They carried painted shields, stone axes, and rifles. a blend of ancient warfare and modern technology that was utterly terrifying. There was no negotiation, no discussion. One of the warriors on foot stepped forward and, without any warning, jammed the head of his stone axe into Hugh's stomach. The blow doubled Hugh over, forcing the air from his lungs. But as he straightened up, gasping, he forced a huge, unnerving smile onto his face, a gesture of defiance that seemed to confuse his attacker. The warrior then turned to Clint, who reacted with stunning speed. In a blur of motion, Clint caught the axe head in one hand and, with his other arm, shoved the warrior square in the chest, knocking him off his feet. Before anyone could react, Clint took the stone axe in both hands, broke the handle clean across his knee, and threw the pieces down in front of the stunned man. It was an incredible display of strength and audacity, and it earned him a moment of silent, grudging respect from the other warriors. The moment passed. The warriors, recovering from their surprise, moved in, and reluctantly, Hugh and Clint allowed their arms to be bound in front of them. The Indians mounted their horses and led their two new captives away in single file, pushing north and west at a relentless pace. By the time they made camp, Hugh was too exhausted to even think about running away. They were given water, and then their legs were bound as well. As night fell, one of their captors began to play a strange instrument, humming a low, sad-sounding song that drifted over the camp. It wasn't a song of triumph, it was a song of mourning, a sorrowful tune for a fate that had already been decided. Hugh Glass fell asleep to that sound, not yet knowing the welcome that awaited him, or the terrible sacrifice his friend was destined to become. The days that followed blurred into a grueling rhythm of walking. For several days they were marched west, keeping pace with the warriors' horses, their world shrinking to the ache in their legs and the dust kicked up by the riders. They passed through vast, untouched landscapes, spotting huge herds of elk and deer that regarded their passage with a strange lack of fear, as if humans were just another harmless part of the scenery. Throughout this forced march, Hugh tried to make sense of their captors. The treatment was rough, a language of shoves and sharp commands, but it wasn't deliberately cruel. They were fed when the Indians ate and given water when they needed it. They were prisoners, but they shared the same conditions as the men who had taken them, sleeping on the hard ground under the same open sky. It was a bizarre kind of equality, one that felt less like compassion and more like careful management. Just when the journey felt like it would stretch on forever, the landscape began to change again. One afternoon, under a high sun, they started to pass signs of cultivation. Small, meticulously tended patches of vegetable gardens appeared in clearings, a startling sign of civilization in the middle of the immense wilderness. The trails became more defined. An hour later, after passing a group of women working in the fields who barely gave them a second glance, they arrived at the village. It was not the simple collection of hide teepees Hugh might have expected. The entire settlement was enclosed by a formidable wooden palisade, a defensive wall standing about 15 feet high. It was a place built to last, a fortress disguised as a town, and as they passed through its gates, Hugh Glass knew they had entered a world with its own rigid set of rules. The inside was a chaotic and fascinating sight. The Pawnee lived in about 40 or 50 large earthen domes, each one roughly 50 feet across and standing 15 to 20 feet high. They were arranged without any obvious pattern, a cluster of grassy mounds that seemed to grow from the earth itself. But Hugh, ever the keen observer, noticed a peculiar detail. Every single dome had a long entranceway, and every single one of them faced east, toward the rising sun. It was a clue, a hint of a deeper cosmology he couldn't begin to decipher. Their arrival was an event. Within moments, hundreds of men, women, and children swarmed them, accompanied by an equal number of barking dogs. The noise and energy were overwhelming. In the midst of the chaos, the warrior with the wolfskin robe and the bear claw necklace reappeared. The same man who had overseen their capture now approached them with a drawn knife. Hugh braced himself, but instead of a blade in the ribs, the warrior simply sliced through the bonds on their wrists, freeing their hands for the first time in days. The gesture was so unexpected it was disorienting. A moment later, a young girl, no older than 8, pushed through the crowd carrying a bowl of water, which she offered to Hugh. Stunned by the simple act of kindness, he accepted. He was then led toward the largest of the earthen lodges, where an old man stood waiting. The man was clearly the chief, adorned with his own magnificent bear claw necklace. He looked Hugh over with a strange, searching gaze, as if he recognized him from some other life, and then a broad smile spread across his face as he welcomed them with a grand, open gesture. It wasn't a smile of warmth, it was a smile of satisfaction, the look of a man whose long-awaited delivery had finally arrived. The transition from prisoner to honored guest was so abrupt it felt like a hallucination. Hugh didn't know what to think. He and Clint were ushered into the chief's large earthen dome, a space buzzing with communal energy. They were given seats near the fire and handed bowls of a rich, savory stew, the best thing they had tasted in months. As they ate, the entire tribe seemed to gather around, watching their every move with an intense, silent fascination. It was like being the main exhibit at a museum, a feeling that was both flattering and deeply unsettling. Whatever had turned the tide in their favor, Hugh was thankful for it, but a knot of confusion tightened in his gut. This level of hospitality didn't align with anything he knew about capture. It felt less like a reprieve and more like a carefully orchestrated performance, and he had no idea what role he was meant to be playing. Once they had finished eating, an older woman approached and led them out of the lodge. To their bewilderment, the entire village followed them, a silent procession heading toward the river. When they reached the bank, the woman turned and immediately began to remove Hugh's tattered clothing. He resisted, confused and embarrassed, but he was surrounded. The women of the village closed in, a cheerful and determined force, and proceeded to strip both men of their rags. They were then pushed into the river while the women scrubbed them clean, a bizarre and invasive baptism that left them feeling utterly powerless. It was a ritual cleansing, a stripping away of their former selves. When they were finally allowed out of the water, they were wrapped in blankets to dry and then presented with new clothes. Soft buckskin leggings, breechcloths, and intricately beaded shirts. They were no longer outsiders, they were being remade in the image of the tribe. As they dressed, a new spectacle began. Though many of the Pawnee men went bare-chested, the villagers seemed completely mesmerized by Clint's physique. He was a powerfully built man, and they crowded around him, their hands reaching out to touch his arms and chest, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief, as if they were confirming he was real. It was an unnerving form of admiration, like farmers assessing a prize bull at market. Once clothed, they were led back to the chief's lodge, where the feast continued. More stew was offered, and this time the chief himself participated in the feeding. Reaching into the bowl, he searched for the most select piece of meat and offered it directly to Hugh. Refusing was not an option. Hugh understood instinctively that it would be a grave insult. He accepted the morsel, the chief's act of generosity, feeling more like an assertion of absolute ownership. As the evening wore on, the village erupted into celebration. The steady, hypnotic beat of drums began to fill the air, accompanied by singing and dancing that would continue for days. Hugh, a captive audience to the festivities, observed the rhythms of their lives. He saw that the women, even the young girls, did most of the work, while the men either lounged or prepared for the hunt. He saw a community bound by affection and a shared purpose, a world away from the petty, vicious cruelty of the pirates he had just escaped. The kindness he witnessed only deepened the mystery. How could a people capable of such warmth also be their captors? The contradiction made no sense. And then, looking across the firelit lodge, he saw her. A young woman walking toward him, her basket held gracefully in her arms. There was something different about her, a quiet intensity that set her apart from every other woman in the village, and a jolt of recognition or perhaps premonition went through him. The celebration raged for 3 days, a relentless assault on the senses. The drumming never stopped, a frantic, escalating heartbeat that drove the entire village into a state of feverish dancing. Hugh wanted to rest, to find a quiet corner and make sense of his situation, but the Pawnee would not leave him alone. They pulled him into the dance, surrounding him with a joyous energy that felt increasingly menacing as his exhaustion grew. The drumming got faster and faster, a spiraling vortex of sound and motion, and then, late on the third night, it abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. In the pre-dawn chill, the entire village began to assemble on a large, open patch of ground east of the palisade. There were more people than Hugh had realized lived there, a silent crowd of at least 1,000, possibly 2,000 souls, all gathered with a single, solemn purpose. In the center of the field, a grim structure waited. It was a wooden framework, a sort of scaffold made of 6 poles, 2 set upright in the ground and 4 running horizontally across them like the rungs of a crude ladder. The entire thing stood about a dozen feet high and 8 feet across, stark against the lightening sky. Behind it stood a line of 20 or 30 of the village's most formidable warriors, motionless and silent. Then the chief appeared, and he was magnificent. He wore a long wolfskin robe so white it seemed to glow, that fell nearly to the ground. He wore no headdress, but a collar of feathers spread down over his chest, and he radiated an aura of absolute power and vitality. He began to speak to his people, his voice carrying across the silent field, and then, with a sudden sharp gesture, he pointed the end of his staff directly at Clint. Instantly, 6 of the waiting warriors stepped forward. There was no hesitation, no debate. The command had been given. They approached Clint, who stood frozen, the dawning horror finally clarifying the purpose of the last 3 days of feasting and ceremony. He was instructed to remove the new buckskin clothes he had been given, and reluctantly, he did as he was told. A moment later, he stood naked before the entire village, his powerful physique, once a source of awe, now just making him a more prominent target. The warriors led him to the framework and forced his arms upward, tying his hands to the 2 top corners. They then bound his feet to the lower corners, pulling his legs wide apart in the process. He hung there, half standing, spread-eagled and completely helpless, a living sacrifice ready for the altar. Witnessing this, something inside Hugh Glass finally snapped. The confusion and fear gave way to a desperate, primal rage. He lunged forward to help his friend, but he was caught from behind before he could take 2 steps. Rough hands grabbed him, and he fought back with everything he had, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. They forced him face down onto the ground, wrenched his arms behind his back, and tied them tightly. Then they dragged him to his knees, forcing his head up so he had a clear, unobstructed view of the scaffold. He was no longer a guest, he was a designated spectator. When he continued to struggle, one of the warriors struck him hard on the back of the head, and the world went dark for a moment. When his vision cleared, the ceremony had begun. One of the warriors ran forward carrying a lit torch. He climbed up next to Clint and, without hesitation, thrust the burning brand under Clint's left arm. Holding it there for several agonizing seconds, Clint screamed in pure agony, a sound that ripped through the morning silence and bucked against his bonds. The warrior was unmoved. He pulled the torch away and then shoved it into Clint's groin, searing his genitals. As the smell of burning flesh filled the air, another man lit a pile of wood that had been placed at the base of the scaffold. And then, the chief gave another signal. A warrior with a bow stepped forward, drew an arrow to its full length, and fired it directly into Clint's chest. He was followed by another, and another. One by one, every man in the village came forward to shoot an arrow into Clint, until his chest resembled some huge, grotesque pincushion, and his screams finally fell silent. Hugh felt something deep within him shrivel and die. He continued to struggle weakly against his bonds, but his body was in a kind of shock, his mind unable to process the sheer, ritualized brutality he had just been forced to witness. His friend was dead. The warriors untied his legs and dragged him, stumbling and numb, back to the chief's lodge. They checked the ropes on his arms to make sure they were still tight, then left him on his sleeping mat, alone in the sudden quiet. He lay there shivering uncontrollably when the young woman, the one he had noticed before, entered the lodge. She covered his shaking body with a heavy buffalo robe, leaned in close, and whispered into his ear in perfect French, a language of impossible salvation in a world of absolute horror. "Do not fear," she said. "They will not make another sacrifice to the morning star until the next moon, what you would call a month." In the aftermath of the ritual, Hugh's mind became a prison of unanswerable questions. 100 of them raged in the silence of the chief's lodge. Why had the Pawnee treated them so well only to murder one of them? If it was a sacrifice, as the woman had said, why had they chosen Clint? Who was this woman? And how did a member of this tribe come to speak flawless French? The questions circled endlessly, providing no comfort, only deepening the wound of his loss. He had lost his friend, but he now realized he had lost something more profound. He had depended on Clint, on his strength and his spirit, far more than he had ever admitted. And with Clint's death, Hugh felt his own hope shrivel and die, leaving him hollowed out and utterly alone. His sleep offered no escape, only pulling him into a recurring nightmare where the pirate Tom Halpern stood at the helm of a ghostly ship, sneering at him. "Life you asked for, and life you have," the ghost would say. "But you will never know peace. You will know hardship and suffering. And when you die, you will die bloody." When his bonds were finally removed, the waking world became just as surreal as his dreams. The Pawnee resumed their courteous treatment as though the horrific events of the previous morning had never taken place. In fact, if anything, they seemed to be in even greater spirits than before, their community life resuming its peaceful, orderly rhythm. The dissonance was maddening. Hugh moved through the village like a ghost, observing the people in their daily routines. He saw none of the petty callousness or suspicion that had dominated the pirate town of Campeche. He saw genuine affection between families and a communal spirit that, under any other circumstance, he might have admired. It was this very decency that made their actions so incomprehensible. He could find nothing in their faces to indicate the eager, brutal disregard they had shown as they dispatched Clint. None of it made any sense. His only anchor in this sea of confusion was the memory of the French words whispered in the dark. For nearly a week, he searched for the woman, his purpose narrowed to this one single desperate goal. He finally found her near the river. He approached her directly, wasting no time. "What is your name?" he asked her in French, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "Little Feather," she told him simply. He then asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why would she hide her ability to speak his tongue from her own people? Her answer changed everything. "They are not my people," she said, her gaze steady. "I am Sioux. They are Pawnee." The revelation was a lightning strike, reconfiguring his entire understanding of his captivity. She was a prisoner too, just a more tenured one. He had to know why she hadn't warned them, why she had let them walk into the ceremony blind. Her logic was as cold and sharp as a winter wind. If she had told them, what good would it have done? They could not have escaped. The Pawnee were masters of this terrain. Telling them would have changed nothing about the outcome, but it would have poisoned Clint's last days with the terror and worry of his own impending doom. "Would you have wanted his last days to be so filled?" she asked. Hugh had no answer. She was right. Then he asked if he could escape. Her assessment was blunt. "Your movements are awkward and clumsy, even for a white man," she stated, not as an insult, but as a simple fact. The Pawnee were expert trackers, and they would find him easily. For now, escape was impossible. She saw the despair return to his eyes and leaned closer. "You must be patient," she told him, her voice low and firm. "There is a way." One man was sacrificed to the Pawnee's morning star, the other was forced to watch, left with the chilling promise that he was next on the calendar. This wasn't just brutality, it was a collision of worlds where ritual, hospitality, and human sacrifice could share the same stage. The story of the escape is even more unbelievable. Subscribe for what comes next.